The Dave LewAllen Podcast is sponsored by Sherm's Candy, a Michigan-based company that specializes in awesome-tasting candy that's in the shape of Michigan. And welcome back to the Dave LewAllen Podcast. Pleased to have you with us today on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, wherever you find your podcasts. We cover sports stories, newsmakers, difference makers. Something that's a little fun today, we're going to talk some music with Gary Graff, the Detroit-based music journalist, longtime author, music critic. He's out with a new book, 501 Essential Albums of the 90s. It is a compendium of the 90s, the albums, the music. And Gary, welcome, first of all.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for the time. This is quite a project.
It was a lot of fun. It was a little crazy. You know, there are 36 contributors to the book. And it was, it's a little bit of squirrel herding, but everybody's a pro. And it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to have that kind of discourse about music. It was like having when you're music geeks and you have that kind of chat about music and back and forth. It was like having that on steroids to do the book.
This has been your life, writing about music, musicians, artists, and this is the music fan's definitive guide of the 90s. And you told me this is the first of what is going to be a series of these decades books?
It is. The 80s book is done, in fact, and that'll be out in May. And then we're talking about which direction, are we going to go forwards or backwards? And we'll see. A lot of that is, as you know, publishers do market research and one of the reasons we started with the 90s was we felt this kind of swell of 90s nostalgia now. We've been through the 80s, not that the 80s are done. 80s nostalgia is done, but we felt like the 90s nostalgia is just starting. So the timing was good to have a book like this come out.
You mentioned the 36 contributors. There are some, to me, familiar names, but with your history in the industry, you were able to reach out to a lot of different people. So take me through that. I mean, you've got chapters of the decades, you've got the albums, and there's a write-up about each of the albums that you've included here. There had to have been some arguments, disagreements, in terms of even putting together a list of 501 albums.
Discussions is the euphemism. We and all of us, all the contributors and myself going back and forth. One of the contributors I live with, and so I got used to I found the most comfortable spots on our back patio some nights too. After one of those discussions, some of the best we did were at concerts. A number of us who are daily music journalists, so we'd be at concerts. And before the show started or in between acts, we would have these euphemistically discussions, and the people around us were like calling security because they got a little loud and a little bit heated. But they were always fun. And, one of the most useful things about that discourse and those discussions was making me think of albums that I wouldn't normally have thought of for a book like this. So there's a reason Savage Garden is in this book, or even Britney Spears, NSYNC, Backstreet Boys, some of those. And, it's because of the contributors who argued passionately why they should be included and convinced me, they made the case. So we included them and it made sense. The idea, the key thing here is the essential part of this is the word essential. And so when we started talking about it and started outlining the book, it was going to be the best of the 90s, which is a different kind of thing. When you say essential, it becomes a little bit more of an academic exercise. And what we wanted to do was create a book that you could hand to somebody and say, this is music in the 90s. This is all of it. And it's going to include some things you might not consider the best. But they don't have to be the best to be essential to your understanding of a decade.
Best might be top selling. as an example, but essential, it may not need to be that
Right.
to fit in your book.
This is what you have. This is what you have to listen to understand the decade.
Yeah. And all genres are covered here. You know, as I read through this, there are bands I never listened to. There are albums I didn't know existed. But I came across the music that I listened to, the different artists. I mean, whether it was, country for a time or rock or, even the pop stuff, there are things there that, of course, that jog your memory. And isn't that one of the beautiful things about a book like this?
Yeah, that's what we wanted to be, part trip down memory lane, part education. As part of it, the wonderful thing about the 90s is all these genres were firing on all cylinders. We came out of the 70s established music in one way. The 80s took it that much further. By the time we get to the 90s, all these genres are firing on all cylinders. And you had, of course, rock and pop and rhythm and blues, and that had been successful for 2, 3, 4 decades prior, but you really had rap on the ascent.
And gangster rap.
And then techno, electronic music was really coming to a fore. And then when you dug into other genres that are perhaps more traditional, they were developing as well and advancing, gospel certainly, and especially country.
Yeah.
Country became a whole different thing in the 90s. Country kind of became rock and roll
Right.
in the 90s as rock began to break up into its own disparate pieces.
Well, George Strait was the king of country at that time, but you had, Tim McGraw and Garth Brooks in particular, and Trisha Yearwood and Vince Gill, who was a favorite of mine, in that period of time. Reba McEntire still very
Dolly
relevant.
Parton was still, Kenny Rogers were still. It's interesting because having done the 80s book now, we had that class of 1989, which was Garth Brooks and Clint Black and Travis Tritt and Alan Jackson, and then to see what they became in the 90s and how Nashville as a music scene and country as a genre really got reworked. But became a lot more popular than it ever was. Some people would say, well, it was always that popular. It was just the rock favoring media were not paying attention. And there's a point to be made in that. But I think country kind of started to meet the rock audience more than halfway.
Yeah.
And people who weren't finding, who didn't find what they wanted in a Nirvana or a Pearl Jam or something, did find it in Garth Brooks and Travis Tritt.
Yeah. Amazing decade for sure. We're going to get more into it with Gary Graff, the Detroit music journalist, joining us on the Dave LewAllen Podcast. He's out with his new book, 501 Essential Albums of the 90s. We're talking music today, but before we continue the conversation, I want to tell you about the sponsor of the Dave LewAllen Podcast. So thrilled to have Sherm's Candy on board with us. Sherm's Candy offers delicious candies, all playfully shaped like the Mitten State itself. Products include classic Michigummies, a delightful taste of gummy goodness, perfect for any candy lover. Decadent chocolate Michigummies, indulge someone special with a chocolatey experience this holiday season. Tart and tangy sour Michigummies pucker up for a stocking stuffer that will leave a lasting impression. Sherm's Candy doesn't forget about your furry friends either. Misha Pups, a tasty treat made just for dogs, ensuring everyone gets a Christmas treat. Find Sherm's Candy at many fine retailers across Michigan or order online at shermscandy.com for a unique and delightful Christmas treat. Gary Graff joins us talking music today and the book 501 Essential Albums of the 90s. Speaking of the holidays, probably make a pretty nice holiday gift.
For all 12 days and all 8 crazy nights, yes.
We talked about the changes in the 90s. I mean, music and genres, but also, vinyl, less of an issue, CDs, but then the whole digital and pirating of music. Talk about the impact of that, if you will, on the 90s.
It's a big topic. So by the 90s, vinyl was gone.
Yeah.
Okay, CDs took over during the 80s, and it's interesting now we see so many of these 90s albums being re-released, but for the first time on vinyl. And I remember when albums were being re-released on CDs, and we're all complaining about, oh, you're making us buy the same thing again.
Yeah.
Now we're saying, oh, you're making us buy the same thing for a third time because we're all back to vinyl again. So it was really, I call, and in the introduction, I call this the 90s were the last great golden age of the album. It was the last decade where we really consumed music primarily by album, and your music discussions were about the album. It was a big deal when that album came out on a Friday. Sorry, no, a Tuesday. It's Fridays now. I was Tuesdays then. And, you really got worked up and ready for it. The number one album on the Billboard chart at the time would sell 500,000 copies, 800,000 copies, 1 million copies in its first week of release. If they sell 40,000 copies right now, they're deliriously happy, and that's because of what happened at the end of the 90s when you started to have Napster come in and file sharing and P2P and all these other ways of sharing and consuming music, not in a physical form. Now, it didn't really impact, the 90s were a decade flush with commercial success, but it didn't take too long to basically put the whole thing into a tailspin into the 2000s. And up till today, we just don't consume albums like we used to, which makes me really sad.
And it's impacted the artists in such a profound way as well, because, their deals are different. Yeah. Their payments, if you will, are different.
Yeah, you make, you make 10 cents for every 1,000 plays on Spotify or something like that. And people are buying songs. If they're buying, they're buying songs, more than likely they're subscribing. So they're not necessarily even owning your music, where in the 90s, we still took a great deal of pride in what our record collections looked like and owning music. Yeah. And we wanted that physical experience of music. It always sounds so much like, the Get Off My Lawn guy when you talk about this. But no, you do remember, even when it was the CD age, people have really lamented the end of vinyl, or the first end of vinyl. But even then in the CD age, you had your CD in your hand, you had the booklet out, you were listening to the lyrics, looking at the artwork, you had that very tactile connectivity with music that is not had as much now. Yeah. It's one of the reasons you see record companies putting out so many of the archival box sets. Bob Dylan, here's 27 discs of live recordings from 1974 with the band, but that audience wants that. Or Green Day's Dookie album, or the American Idiot box set that came out. You want to hold this thing in your hands, and you want to have a book, and you want it to be an experience and a journey, if you will.
I have my vinyl still, thankfully. Yeah. Can't say, I've got the system that I once had to enjoy that vinyl.
You can rebuild it.
That's got to come.
Yeah.
All those CDs. Thankfully, my mom never threw out my baseball cards either, so I've got those as a kid growing up.
I can't say the same thing.
Yeah, well.
Or comic books.
Yeah, well, there you go. Sad for that.
Yep.
But, I don't want to give up that piece of my history, the vinyl, I mean, the CDs, I don't have as much of an attachment to, of course, but the albums, that was my youth.
So I was a vinyl kid, of course, but I was the guy they invented CDs for, because you didn't have to get up to flip it over. And they call me lazy, but I did enjoy that part of it. But I still have the vinyl, and I'm heartened a little bit to see vinyl making the smaller than they want you to think it is resurgence, but there is some deal of resurgence. And I'm not entirely sure it's for all the right reasons. I think a lot of people buy vinyl for decorative reasons now, and they're still listening on their phone or on their digital device. But they are consumed. They do see some value in vinyl now, and in a physical, having a physical piece of music.
Well, and if it's nothing more than marketing, I mean, that's a part of what music has always been as well. And when we talk about the 90s, I mean, let's talk about the growing influence of the internet and what that has meant for record companies, but for artists as well. Maybe it was in some ways harder to find the music, but there was also this new way of exposing yourself as a band or a group.
Double-edged sword, the internet and that proliferation of information. On one hand, if you're a big music fan and you can find out anything you want about your favorite act in a nanosecond, just with a couple of clicks. But again, back to Get Off My Lawn, in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, there was a mystery to these artists. You had to wait for Rolling Stone magazine to come out, or Circus, or Cream, or or Crawdaddy, or any of the. You had to wait for a publication to come out, and they were almost never on TV, and very rarely in mainstream media. But that mystery, I think, fueled interest and fueled intrigue, that made you pay closer attention and built a different kind of connection than now. What the information overload has given us now is disposability.
Yeah.
And okay, I'm on this, I'm with Sabrina Carpenter this week, fine. And now I'm on Chapel Roan tomorrow. And that's really what the impact has been. Yeah. I find that when I talk to younger listeners, they are more intrigued by the older artists, because even though there's information on the internet, plenty of it, there maybe isn't as much, or they're drawn in by the depth of the story, by decades of history that some of these artists and bands have. So that's it really did, as you say, it changed the entire landscape of our music experience, both for the good and for the bad.
And we'll talk a little bit more about some specific debuts and bands coming up. Gary Graff joining me, 501 Essential Albums of the 90s. My guest, Gary Graff, on the Dave LewAllen Podcast today. Well, one more word about our sponsor, Sherm's Candy, on this episode of the show. And Sherm's Candy would like to see you put a smile on faces this Christmas with a taste of Michigan. Sherm's Candy offers delicious candies, all playfully shaped like the Mitten State itself. Products include classic Michigummies, decadent chocolate Michigummies, tart and tangy sour Michigummies. Furry friends are covered as well with Misha Pups, a tasty treat, a new treat made just for dogs, ensuring everyone gets a treat around the holiday time. And Christmas, New Year's, it's all ahead of us. Find Sherm's Candy at many fine retailers across Michigan, or order online at shermscandy.com for a unique and delightful holiday gift. MC Hammer. In the 90s.
You're gonna touch that, huh?
Yeah, there you go. Mariah Carey. I don't know if Destiny's Child was 90s, but Beyonce.
No, well, by Beyonce as a solo, but Destiny's Child too. They had been around in the late 80s, but certainly their heyday was in the 90s.
Yeah. Lots of acts. Ice Cube, Ice-T, on and on, right? I mean,
Nirvana, Pearl Jam,
yeah.
Soundgarden had been around, but you had Oasis, that whole new wave of Britpop, Blur, The Laws, bands like that. Sure. Like in any decade, but
most impactful in your mind of the debut or emerging artists of the 90s?
It's a great question. There, and there were a few. I mean, I think obviously Nirvana, and Nirvana, that wasn't their debut. They had Bleach out before Nevermind, but Nevermind was the first major label album, and that was the smell heard around the world, the Teen Spirit smell, and totally changed its success, totally changed the major record companies' approach to rock music. And then Pearl Jam followed in its wake, even though, interestingly, Pearl Jam's first album actually came out shortly before Nevermind.
Oh.
But it was Nevermind that had the real impact. So you had that going on. You had a lot of key rap acts come out during the 90s, from A Tribe Called Quest all the way to 1999 Eminem with the Slim Shady LP. So and what had happened really was, so the profits of the 80s were channeled into, let's sign more bands, let's make more money. In the 90s, so let's go find who we think we can sell. and the record companies were flush with cash and willing to spend it, albeit also willing to recoup it from the artists they were signing. So if you were successful, you did well. If not, not so much. Oasis was very impactful too, because that launched a whole new wave of Britpop, probably the biggest we've seen since maybe Duran Duran, in the 80s, which launched its own kind of movement. But certainly, the Beatles and the Stones and the Kinks and the Who back in the 60s, we saw something like that happen in the 90s. I don't think they had the same degree of impact because you had to compete against more bands and more different genres. But it was still pretty big, and you saw that impact this year when Oasis decided to reunite and put their tickets on sale, and just the sheer demand for these shows.
Yeah, yeah. Let's spend a moment. You're Detroit-based. We're local here. The phenomenon of Eminem, and at the end of the 90s, and what he's meant, since that time in the industry.
Yeah, I think everybody knew something big was happening. When the Slim Shady LP came out, I don't know that we saw what it was going to become over the course of the next decade. But, here was a very original sounding rapper, and importantly, a white rapper who came in at a time when white rap had gotten a bad name. Thank you, Vanilla Ice.
Right.
And here was a guy with real cred. Dr. Dre, he had the mark of Dr. Dre on him, and enormous talent as a lyricist and as an MC. To listen, first of all, to listen to him rap, and it wasn't speed for speed's sake. It was very akin to a guitarist. Jimi Hendrix was not just for its own sake, or Eddie Van Halen.
Yeah.
These guys were really saying something with those flurries of notes. Yeah. Eminem was doing the same thing with his voice.
I mean, I'm astounded to this day.
Yeah. And then there were the lyrics themselves where, your jaw dropped like 3 times every song on that album. He's what? Huh?
Yeah.
But it was so clever and funny too. He had that gift of saying something really dark, but then a few minutes later, something really funny. And you felt a connection to this guy because he did give you an entire person in his presentation, whereas I think we could say there were a lot of MCs that really presented a very monolithic image, and didn't give you a lot of nuance in their personality. Eminem gave you the good, the bad, the ugly, the pretty.
Oh yeah,
everything
it was
about
all
him
on display.
And I think that got listeners of many ages, and white, black, whoever, really connected to him as a person who was telling these tales. And even if he was just telling tales, they connected to the imagination.
And as much impact as the music has made, the tours that he's had, there's, to me, it seems like there's still a little mystery about Eminem always, which speaks to your point earlier of some of the attractiveness or interest in artists. He's out there, but he's not all out there.
He has total control. He's one of few artists that have managed to do that. And while there are rumors and scuttlebutt and things like that, there's not that much of it. And his audience is served by what he chooses to give them, because it's also when he posts something, when he shares something on social media, when he does something on his his radio network, it's always something of value and real quality. And so people aren't running around trying to find whatever they can about Eminem or from Eminem. They know they're confident he's going to give it to them, whether it's an album, whether it's something on shady radio, right. Whether it's an internet post or something like that, they feel confident he's going to give it to them. And he's just not out there all that much. You see him at a Lions game once in a while, doesn't perform very many concerts,
right.
Doesn't do interviews, but he gives you what he wants to give you. And I'll repeat, every time he gives us something, it seems to be something of real quality, something that's very entertaining and well worth our while. And it's very rare when you can do that as an artist. you're satisfying your audience, and they don't have to go looking for other things. So
Another local artist emerging at that time, Kid Rock.
yes. And he was part of what was called the new NU rock movement, the rap rock movement. But, Devil Without a Cause, one of the most, and it's in the book, and it's one of the most impactful albums, certainly of the 90s, even though he wasn't the first one. It had such a huge commercial success, and it applied a pop sensibility. He has a good sense of melody. He knows what a hook is. And so to hear those songs, to hear Ba Wada Ba, and then to come with Only God Knows Why, and pull at everybody's heartstrings like that, it really was a great mix of music that caught people's imagination, and he knew how to be a personality as well. I mean, he played all the media avenues. Without a doubt.
Yeah.
And it was something to watch. And he worked really, I mean, he had worked so hard to get to that point. And so had Eminem. Eminem in a much more underground fashion. Kid Rock was banging it in the clubs here and out on the road I'm sure it wasn't as good as a Winnebago, but out on the road in a motorhome, doing the Bob Seger thing, who was one of his models.
Well, and those stories, even to this day, so few make it, right?
Right.
And a lot of others, try that way, do that work, town to town, club to club,
Right.
but to then make it, I mean, man, it's luck, I suppose, to some degree, but it's a lot of hard work. It has to be.
And some of that, not that it wasn't hard work, but some of that went away to a degree in the 80s and the 90s because MTV became the club circuit.
Okay.
And not just referring to Club MTV, but you really were focused on if there had been social media in the 80s, it would have been fascinating to see how MTV and social media would have kind of ping-ponged and dovetailed with each other. But that to me really was what became the club circuit. And bands were still out there playing, but your profits back then really came from releasing music, making records.
Now it's reversed.
It's reversed. Now you have to be, because you went on the road to promote your records. Now you're out on the road, you're making new music just to have something to call attention to yourself when you're coming to somebody's town.
Yeah.
And hopefully you'll sell tickets and some t-shirts.
And that's how a majority of money for artists is made today versus the album sales.
Yeah, unless you're Taylor Swift or a Beyonce, or in the short term a Sabrina Carpenter or an Olivia Rodrigo or something. Yeah, you've got to tour again. And that's and you have to sell merchandise, and you have to find merchandising opportunities, and even more importantly, sync rights, which is copyright. Selling, basically giving rights for ads, for movies, for video games. That's really where the money is for recorded music now, not so much on selling a record or a single.
Anything we haven't covered? Well, Shania Twain.
She
was big in the 90s, certainly.
She redefined the female country artist as rock artist and pop artist. She was a great package. And you have to remember with her, it was her husband, Mutt Lange, who was her producer. This is the guy who gave us AC/DC Back in Black, who gave us Def Leppard, Pyromania and Hysteria, who gave us Bryan Adams albums. He was a sharp producer, a very talented songwriter. He knew how to make a record that would sell to the masses, even if it was considered a country record.
Yeah. Well, and she did. She sold them.
Oh, no, she was huge. We had the Dixie Chicks arrive in the 90s, and there was another way of bringing country music to the masses in a different kind of flavor.
Yeah. How about a word about the boy bands? NSYNC, Backstreet Boys.
I lived through that via daughter.
Yeah.
But it was like seeing New Kids or the Osmonds or the Jackson 5. That's going to be a cyclical thing. We're probably due for another boy band movement sometime soon right now. But you did have you had good boy bands who were being marketed properly. So yeah, Backstreet and NSYNC, the two main ones. They were coming off of New Edition and New Kids on the Block, who were earlier in the decade and also in the 80s. And then you had a new crew of female pop acts. There were not girl groups as much as there were Britney Spears and Debbie, now Deborah Gibson.
Yes.
And now I'm gonna, you do these two books back to back, and they all Tiffany. So you had a whole movement of pop, and pop is always understandable.
Oh, yeah.
You give somebody a good hook and something you can hum, that's always going to sell, whether it's a rock tune or a rap tune or a pop tune.
Yeah, in your head for sure. 501 essential albums of the 90s. Gary Graff, the editor of this. It's the first in what will be a series of books. So he mentioned the 80s come next. I'm going to be very interested in reading that as well. If you had to pick a favorite album of the 90s, difficult, I know, or a couple of your favorites.
A couple, that's nice to ask, because there are two questions I usually play off about the book. One is, what's your favorite album in the 90s? The other is, what was 502? I will.
All right, what was 502?
No, I will. These are the 500 ones.
Okay.
There was no 502. That's them, and I'll die on that sword.
All right, very good.
Favorite albums from the 90s, World Party, Goodbye Jumbo, Big Chief, Detroit band, Ann Arbor band, actually, Mack Avenue Skull Game. And of course the Oasis, first couple Oasis albums. We're gonna get going here, and we'll be into your next episode. It's funny when we said 501, it's like, that's a lot. Are we going to be able to come up with 501? And then when you make a long list of 2,300, oh yeah, there was a lot of good music.
Yeah,
that decade, and it's even harder in the 80s, and it will be in the 70s when we get to that. So
aren't we lucky to have all this great music to choose from? Because look, I don't have a musical bone in my body, but
you have yours.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Yeah,
I can enjoy all of it, and especially those things that, yes, do catch your ear, and it's a big part of our lives, music.
And has become even bigger. So that's, as we talk about the evolution of media and technology, and one of the reasons why it seems less impactful now is it's more impactful now because it's a totality.
Yeah.
Everywhere you go, TV, movies, video games, your phone sings to you when somebody's making a phone call. Music is so total that we almost take it for granted now and forget to immerse ourselves in a great piece of work like an album.
Yeah.
But that's still speaks to how important it is in our lives, and why we need to take hard looks and separate the wheat from the chaff, as they say, and really try to guide people to the great music and hopefully increase an appreciation for it.
Best place to pick up the book at?
I always make a pitch for your local independent bookseller. Right. If you have one, go there. Of course, it's on Amazon and all the mass sellers. If you see me driving around, it's in the trunk of my car. So beep, we'll pull over and I'll make a sale.
Great gift suggestion. 501 essential albums of the 90s. Again, the first in a series. Gary Graff, the editor, our guest today on the Dave LewAllen Podcast. Thank you so much for coming in. Thank you for the time. Who doesn't like to talk about music?
It's the best. It really is good fun. And thank you for having me. As somebody who's watched you for a number of years, it really is a pleasure to have a conversation.
Well, it's great to have you here. Thank you. Best of luck with the book going forward as well. And when the 80s come out, let's do this again.
We'll be here.
All right. Gary Graff.
I'll even wear spandex for you.
There you go. The Detroit music journalist joining us on the Dave LewAllen Podcast today. Hope you've enjoyed this conversation. Tell a friend about it. Share it with a friend as we continue to grow our audience, as we bring you these great conversations. As always, we want to thank you for the time today. And until next time, stay safe, be kind. The Dave LewAllen Podcast is sponsored by Sherm's Candy, a Michigan-based company that specializes in awesome tasting candy that's in the shape of Michigan.